Hey, hello there, and welcome back to Deep Sleepy History. Tonight, tonight we're going somewhere far away, somewhere warm and golden and a little dangerous. We're going to Egypt, not the Egypt of the pyramid builders. That's already ancient history by the time we arrive, but a later Egypt, a glittering, complicated, anxious Egypt, balanced right on the edge of an empire it can't quite control. We're going to spend tonight with Cleopatra. And I think most of us carry around this small, flattened version of her in our heads. A beautiful queen, a doomed romance, a snake. That's about it, right? That's the cartoon version. But the real story, the real story is so much stranger and so much more impressive than that. So just let your shoulders drop for a second. Let your jaw unclench. There's nowhere you need to be right now except here, drifting through ancient Alexandria with me. Let's begin. Part 1. A queen closer to us than you'd think. Here's a fact that always stops me in my tracks, every single time I think about it. Cleopatra was born closer to the moon landing than to the building of the Great Pyramid. Just sit with that for a second. The pyramids, when Cleopatra was a little girl walking through her father's palace, were already more than 2,000 years old. To her, they weren't a recent achievement. They weren't even really history in the way she understood her own world. They were almost mythical, ancient monuments from some impossibly distant past, the way the Roman Colosseum feels to us now, except multiply that by 10. So when we picture Cleopatra, we shouldn't picture someone living in some vague, undifferentiated, ancient times. She lived in a very specific, very late moment, a moment when an old civilization was trying desperately to hold on to itself, while a new and hungry power was rising in the West. That power, of course, was Rome, and Cleopatra was the last of the pharaohs, the very last one. After her, there would be no more queens or kings ruling Egypt as Egypt's own. The line that stretched back thousands of years simply stopped. That's the scale of what we're talking about tonight. Not just a queen, not just a romance. The final chapter of one of the oldest political traditions human beings have ever built. Let your mind sit with that scale for a moment, the weight of it, and then let it go soft again, because we have a long, slow road ahead of us tonight, and there's no rush at all. Part 2. A Greek queen in an Egyptian crown. Now, here's something that surprises a lot of people. Cleopatra wasn't really Egyptian, not by blood anyway. Her family, the Ptolemies, were Macedonian Greeks. They traced their line back to one of Alexander the Great's own generals, a man named Ptolemy, who grabbed Egypt for himself after Alexander died and his empire shattered into pieces. For generation after generation after that, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, but they ruled like outsiders in a way. Their court spoke Greek. Their capital, Alexandria, faced out toward the Mediterranean Sea, toward Greece and Rome, rather than inward toward the Nile. Most of Cleopatra's ancestors never really bothered learning the Egyptian language. Why would they? They had translators. They had administrators. Egypt's wealth flowed up to them either way. But Cleopatra was different. She learned Egyptian, actually learned it properly in a dynasty that had mostly ignored it for centuries. And ancient writers say she learned other languages too, many of them, which let her speak directly, without translators, to ambassadors and priests and visiting dignitaries from a dozen different nations. I want you to notice what that really means. It's not just a charming personal detail, a little party trick for a queen. It's strategy. It's intelligence, applied very deliberately. A ruler who can step into someone else's language, even briefly. Gain something a translator can never give her: trust, closeness, the sense, in the other person's mind, of being truly heard. She understood something her ancestors had mostly missed. Egypt wasn't just a treasury to be drained from a palace balcony. It was an old, sacred civilization with its own gods, its own priesthoods, its own deep and ancient expectations about what a true ruler should be. So in the great halls of Alexandria, she could be a Greek queen, fluent in philosophy and rhetoric, trading clever words with visiting Roman senators. And then, on the walls of a temple far up the Nile, she could appear as something else entirely, a pharaoh, carved in stone, making offerings to ancient gods, dressed in crowns that had symbolized divine kingship for 2,000 years before she was even born. 2 faces, 2 languages, 2 whole worlds held together inside one woman. That's not romance. That's architecture. The architecture of survival. Part 3, a throne built on debt. Let's slow down here for a moment, because I think it's easy to imagine Cleopatra inheriting some glittering, secure, untouchable kingdom. She didn't. By the time she came to power, Egypt was wealthy, yes, extraordinarily wealthy, actually full of grain and gold and trade, but it was also fragile, vulnerable, quietly drowning in debt. Her own father, Ptolemy XII, had once been driven out of Egypt entirely, thrown out by his own people or by rival factions within his own court. The details get a little murky depending which ancient writer you trust. And to get his throne back, he did something that would shadow the rest of his family's reign. He turned to Rome. Roman soldiers, Roman money, Roman influence. That's what restored him to power. And nothing in Rome, of course, came free. Egypt fell into debt, into obligation, into a tangled web of favors owed to Roman bankers and Roman generals and Roman senators, all of whom now felt they had a stake in whatever happened next along the Nile. So when young Cleopatra finally took the throne, and she was young, only around 18 years old, she didn't inherit a clean slate. She inherited a crown with strings attached. Heavy, invisible strings, all leading back to Rome. Imagine that pressure for a second. Imagine being 18, suddenly the ruler of one of the richest nations in the known world, and already understanding, with total clarity, that the most powerful military force on the planet is watching you, waiting to see whether you're useful or whether you're a problem to be solved. That was Cleopatra's starting position, not a fairy tale, a chessboard, and she was the most exposed piece on it. Part 4, a crowded, dangerous family. Now, before Cleopatra ever had to deal with Rome directly, she had to survive something much closer to home, her own family. The Ptolemies had a strange, almost ritualized way of organizing power. Brothers and sisters were often married to one another, not for love, obviously, but keep the bloodline pure, to keep rival families from gaining a claim to the throne through marriage. It sounds shocking to modern ears, I know, but within that system, it was simply how power was protected. Cleopatra began her reign sharing the throne with her younger brother, a boy named Ptolemy XIII. On paper, this was meant to look like unity, brother and sister ruling together, just as tradition demanded. In reality, it was a powder keg. Her brother was young, really young, which made him easy to control. And there were men around him, advisors and courtiers, who saw an obvious opportunity. A young, pliable boy king on the throne, with a powerful, independent-minded sister, standing in the way of their own ambitions. So they push her out. Cleopatra was forced from Alexandria, driven from her own capital, her own palace, by men hiding behind her brother's name. And here's the thing I find so remarkable about her story. This could have been the end. A young queen, exiled within the first few years of her reign, quietly fading into irrelevance while a council of advisors ruled in her brother's name. Instead, it became the beginning of one of history's great comebacks. Part 5, smuggled into power. While Cleopatra was in exile, gathering whatever support she could, a Roman general arrived in Egypt, a general chasing down his greatest rival in a brutal Roman civil war. His name was Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra understood almost instantly what his arrival meant. Whoever could reach Caesar first, whoever could shape his understanding of the situation in Alexandria, that person would hold enormous power over whatever happened next. But there was a problem. Her enemies controlled the capital. They controlled the palace gates. A young exiled queen couldn't simply walk up and request an audience with the most powerful man in the Roman world. So, according to the old stories, at least, and yes, Some of the details may have grown more dramatic in the retelling over the centuries. She had herself smuggled into the palace, hidden, wrapped in side bedding, carried right past the very guards who were supposed to be keeping her out. And then, in front of Julius Caesar himself, she emerged. Just picture that scene for a moment. The boldness of it, the sheer nerve required. A young woman, barely into her 20s, risking capture, risking death, simply put herself directly in front of the one man whose decision could save her entire reign. It worked. Caesar was taken with her, not merely in some simple romantic sense, though that part of the story is certainly true too. He recognized something in her: intelligence, nerve, political usefulness. He threw his support behind her claim to the throne, and Egypt was plunged into a short, brutal conflict known as the Alexandrian War. Her younger brother's forces were eventually defeated, and in a strange, almost symbolic twist of fate, the boy king drowned in the Nile itself while trying to flee the battle, the very river that had given Egypt its life, becoming, in this one moment, the setting of a king's disappearance. Cleopatra was queen again, and this time she had the backing of Rome's most powerful man standing behind her. Part 6. A son named for an empire. Not long after, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar. The Egyptians called him Caesarion, Little Caesar, and the meaning of that name was enormous. Caesar had no other publicly acknowledged biological child. None. So this boy, born to an Egyptian queen, carrying the name of Rome's most powerful man, became something almost impossible to categorize cleanly. In Egypt, he could be presented as a natural continuation of her dynasty, the next pharaoh in an ancient line. In Rome, his very existence was complicated and dangerous in ways that would only become clear later. Cleopatra later traveled to Rome itself, staying near the city while Caesar was at the absolute height of his power. Picture her there, this foreign queen in the middle of a city that distrusted monarchy on a deep, almost instinctive cultural level. Watched, discussed, resented by some, fascinated by others. Caesar even had a statue of her placed inside a temple dedicated to Venus, a goddess his own family claimed descent from. To his supporters, it might have looked like an honor. To his critics, it looked like something far more troubling: a foreign queen being elevated into the very heart of Roman religious and political life. And then, everything changed in a single, sudden moment. Caesar was assassinated. Let your breathing settle here for a moment. We're going to keep going, slowly, into the next chapter of her story. Part 7. Alone in a collapsing world. Caesar's murder didn't just remove one powerful man from a world. It shattered the entire structure Cleopatra had built her recent diplomacy around. Suddenly, Rome was chaos. Senators, soldiers, assassins, rivals. All of them recalculating. All of them deciding who to follow next. And Cleopatra, who had been near the city at this exact, perilous moment, found her own position transformed overnight, from honored ally to a foreign queen with very uncertain protection. She returned to Egypt as quickly as she could, and once home, she made a bold move. She elevated her young son, Caesarion, to the position of co-ruler. Still just a small child, but now formally presented as heir, as continuation, as living proof that her dynasty would carry on. It was, in its own way, an act of defiance, a statement that said, Rome may be in chaos, but Egypt still has its line of succession. Egypt still has its future mapped out. Meanwhile, far away, a new power struggle was unfolding inside Rome itself. And eventually, one of the men at the center of that struggle would come looking for Cleopatra. His name was Mark Antony. Part 8. The queen who made an entrance. Antony summoned Cleopatra to a city called Tarsus. He wanted to question her about her loyalty during the recent chaos, about where Egypt's resources had really gone during Rome's civil wars. He expected, more or less, to interrogate a subject ruler, someone who owed him explanations. What he got instead was theater. Pure, deliberate, masterful theater. Cleopatra didn't rush to him. She made him wait. And when she finally arrived, she came by river, on a barge so magnificent that ancient writers describe it almost like something out of myth. Gilded decoration, perfumed air drifting across the water, music carrying ahead of her arrival. The entire scene staged with precision of performance meant to overwhelm the senses. By the time she actually stepped before him, the entire emotional balance of their meeting had already shifted. He had summoned her to judge her. Instead, he found himself almost auditioning for her attention. This wasn't vanity. This was strategy, dressed up as splendor. Cleopatra understood something profound about power in the ancient world. That authority isn't only built through armies and treaties. It's built through perception, through spectacle, through the careful, deliberate construction of an image so dazzling that people forget to ask harder questions underneath it. And it worked spectacularly. Antony and Cleopatra became partners, politically and personally. She offered him something his ambitious Eastern military campaigns desperately needed: wealth, grain, ships, the administrative machinery of one of the richest kingdoms on earth. In return, he offered her something just as valuable: protection, prestige, and territory. He even granted her lands beyond Egypt's own borders, parts of Syria, Cyprus, valuable coastal regions, restoring, in a sense, some of the wider influence earlier Ptolemaic rulers had once enjoyed. To her, it looked like dynastic revival. To Antony's enemies back in Rome, it looked like something far more dangerous. Part 9. Children born into a storm. Cleopatra and Antony had children together. Twins, in fact, whom they named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Sun and moon. Names chosen quite deliberately, meant to evoke something vast, cosmic, almost destined. In a grand public ceremony remembered as the donations of Alexandria, Antony formally granted these children, along with Caesar Ion, sweeping royal titles and territories across the eastern Mediterranean. To Cleopatra's supporters, this looked like the restoration of a great eastern kingdom. To Antony's enemies in Rome, it looked like betrayal, a Roman general handing away Roman influence to foreign children, bowing to an eastern queen. And waiting back in Rome, watching all this very, very carefully, was a young man named Octavian. Octavian was Caesar's adopted heir, and he was patient, calculating, and exceptionally skilled at something Cleopatra herself understood deeply: the power of a well-told story. He couldn't easily attack Antony directly. Antony was, after all, a respected Roman commander with loyal soldiers and a proud reputation. Attacking him outright risked looking like simple political ambition, one Roman general tearing down another. But Cleopatra was easier to turn into a villain. Foreign, wealthy, royal, already wrapped in centuries of Roman suspicion toward Eastern monarchs. So Octavian built his case carefully. He didn't need to fight Antony as a rival. He needed to frame the entire conflict as something else entirely: Rome defending itself against a dangerous foreign queen who had somehow ensnared one of its own generals. It was, in many ways, one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in ancient history. And it worked. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's perfectly all right. Just let them close. I'll keep going softly, and you can simply listen, drifting in and out, however feels natural. The battle that decided everything. The conflict finally reached its breaking point near the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, in the year 31 before Christ. It was a naval battle. Ships, wind, formation, chaos on open water. One of the most consequential battles in the entire history of the ancient Mediterranean. Cleopatra's fleet carried something more than soldiers. It carried Egypt's treasure, gold, valuables, the resources that might allow her to continue resisting or negotiating or simply surviving, even if the battle itself went badly. And the battle did go badly. At a crucial moment, Cleopatra's ships withdrew, and Antony followed her, leaving the main battle behind. To this day, historians still debate exactly why, whether it was a planned strategic retreat or a desperate, chaotic decision made under the pressure of collapsing odds. But whatever the reason, the political damage was immediate and devastating. To Antony's soldiers, to his allies, to all of Rome, it looked like one thing only: a Roman commander abandoning his own forces for the sake of a foreign queen. His support began to crumble. Allies defected. Confidence drained away. And slowly, inevitably, Octavian's path toward total victory opened wide. Part 11, the final year. Here's something I find genuinely remarkable about Cleopatra's story. Even after Actium, Even after the battle that should have ended everything, she didn't simply collapse into despair. She kept making moves, kept thinking, kept searching for a way through. She explored a possible escape route toward the Red Sea, considering whether her ships might carry her family, her wealth, and her hopes beyond the reach of Roman power entirely. Toward Arabia, toward new alliances in a different world altogether. Some of those ships were reportedly burned before the plan could ever come together, destroyed, perhaps, by hostile forces determined to close off every remaining option. She tried diplomacy with Octavian directly, testing what he truly wanted. Her surrender, her treasure, her children, herself. Paraded through Rome as a trophy of his victory, every message exchanged between them was a quiet, desperate calculation. A queen trying to understand the appetite of the man who now held her entire future in his hands. Eventually, Alexandria itself fell. Antony, hearing a false report that Cleopatra had died, took his own life and was carried to her, dying in one of the most genuinely tragic scenes preserved from the ancient world. Whatever the complicated political reality of their partnership had been, in that final moment, it became something achingly, undeniably human. Part 12. A Queen's Last Choice. Cleopatra met with Octavian after Antony's death. She tried, even then, to negotiate, to find some path forward for herself, for her children, for whatever might remain of her legacy. But Octavian wanted something specific. He wanted her alive, for one particular purpose, to be displayed in Rome, in his triumphal procession, paraded through the streets as living proof of his victory. The ultimate humiliation for a queen who had spent her entire life carefully constructing an image of divine, untouchable authority. And so, according to the accounts that have come down to us, Cleopatra made her final decision. She chose death on her own terms rather than that humiliation. The story of the snake, the ASP, smuggled in somehow, delivering a quiet and supposedly painless death, has become one of the most famous images in all of ancient history. Whether it happened exactly that way remains genuinely uncertain. Ancient sources disagree. Some mention poison instead. The full truth of her final hours may simply be lost to us now, blurred somewhere between fact and legend. But what is certain is this: Rome conquered her kingdom. Rome conquered her armies, her capital, her treasury. But it never got to conquer her, not completely. Octavian never got his living, chained queen marching to the streets of Rome. Her last act of power was authorship over her own ending. With Cleopatra's death, nearly 3,000 years of pharaonic rule came to its quiet, final close. Egypt became a Roman province, not an ordinary one. Either Augustus, as Octavian would soon be known, kept it under unusually tight personal control, fully aware of just how valuable and how dangerous that wealthy kingdom could be in the wrong hands. Cleopatra's son Caesarion, the boy who carried Julius Caesar's name, did not survive long after his mother. Octavian had him killed, coldly, deliberately, reasoning, according to the old accounts, that the world simply wasn't safe enough for two men carrying the name of Caesar. Her younger children, though, were spared, taken to Rome, raised, strangely enough, inside the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, the very woman whose marriage Antony had set aside for Cleopatra. One of those children, her daughter Cleopatra Selene, eventually became a queen herself, ruling in North Africa, carrying fragment of her mother's lost dynasty into an entirely new chapter, far from the Nile. And Octavian himself rose to become Augustus, Rome's very first emperor. Cleopatra's defeat didn't just end her own story. It helped close the door on the old Roman Republic altogether, and open the door to an entirely new age of empire. Part 14, The Queen Behind the Legend. I think what strikes me most, returning to Cleopatra's story again and again, is just how much we've lost underneath the legend. The romantic version, beautiful queen, doomed love, tragic ending. That's the version that survived best, because it's the easiest one to tell. Shakespeare gave her unforgettable language. Hollywood gave her spectacle on a grand scale. But underneath all of that performance was a ruler doing something extraordinarily difficult, holding together an ancient, fragile kingdom against the gravitational pull of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. She spoke many languages. She studied philosophy and rhetoric. She understood with total clarity that power lived not only in armies, but in image, in ceremony, in the careful, deliberate construction of meaning. She used motherhood as politics. She used religion as diplomacy. She used spectacle as a weapon more effective, in many moments, than any army she could have raised. Much of what survives about her came down to us through the voices of the very people who defeated her, Roman writers, shaping her memory to justify Octavian's war, to explain why a foreign queen needed to be conquered. So even now, more than 2,000 years later, historians are still carefully separating the real Cleopatra from the propaganda built around her name. And maybe that's part of why her story still pulls at us all this time later. There's enough fact here to astonish, and enough mystery left over to keep us wondering, closing. And so, gently, we come to the end of Cleopatra's reign. Tonight we follow the queen standing at the very edge of two worlds, ancient Egypt fading and rising Rome hungry and unstoppable. We watch her survive exile, family betrayal, war, and loss. We watch her build alliances out of nothing but intelligence and nerve. We watch the kingdom, glittering and wealthy, slowly drawn into a struggle far larger than itself. Let that whole story begin to settle now. Let the marble halls of Alexandria grow quiet. Let the harbor lights dim, one by one, across the dark water. Let the Nile keep moving, slow and steady, the way it always has, carrying the last reflections of a vanished crown gently out toward the sea. There's nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. Let your shoulders soften completely. Let your breathing slow, easy and unhurried. Let every thought drift past, quietly, like a small boat carried along a calm river current. If you enjoyed this journey with me tonight, I'd love it if you consider subscribing. It genuinely helps me keep bringing these slow, calm history journeys to you every single week. And if you're somehow still awake right now, there's another story waiting for you whenever you're ready. But for now, let the past rest. Sleep well, and good night.